She nodded. So did several others. That only happens in the movies, Reef said. Believe me. So did you learn anything different today? The soft-voiced boy asked. Reef smiled at him. I learn something new every time, he said, and slipped the object into his pocket. He glanced at his watch. And speaking of time, we're just about out of it. But before I go, there's one more thing I'd like to say. He cleared his throat. This was always the hardest part, trying not to sound preachy. There's another reason I'm glad the judge ordered me to do this. It's because I hope what I have to say to people will make a difference. I'm only a few years older than you are, but that's plenty of time to make mistakes, big ones. Most of the things I regret in my life I did because I was afraid. I used to think it was because I was angry. Anger is a hard thing to deal with, but I think fear is harder. It makes you feel more alone. If there's something bothering you, there are people who can help. I'm going to leave some cards with your teacher, and if you think you'd like to talk to someone sometime, call the number on the card, okay? Mr. Brighton stood up and moved to the front of the room. I'd like to take this opportunity, he said, to thank you for coming in to talk to us. You can tell from the questions that everyone was very interested in what you had to say today. He turned to the class. Let's show Mr. Kennedy our appreciation, okay? Everyone clapped, including Robbie. When the bell rang and the class was filing out, he said to Reef, I still think you should be getting money for this. Reef grinned and turned to collect his jacket, which he'd hung over the teacher's chair. Great presentation, Mr. Brighton said, smiling. Really, I wish they paid as much attention to me. Reef flushed. Thanks. Ever think of making a career of this? The teacher asked. Reef nodded. I've been thinking about that quite a lot lately. You're a natural. I'd give it some more thought if I were you. What are you going to do now? I'm in my final year of school. I get time off to give these talks. How many more do you have left to do? Technically, Reef replied, slipping on his jacket, I'm all done. Finished last semester. The teacher cocked an eyebrow. And today? Reef shrugged. Hard to explain. People keep calling and asking, and I keep saying yes. Just something I still need to do, I guess. Brighton held out his hand. Well, I'm certainly glad you're doing it. He shook Reef's hand firmly. Mr. Kennedy. Reef turned to see the red-haired girl standing by the teacher's desk. She was the last of the students to leave. Call me Reef, he said. The Mr. Kennedy stuff is hard to get used to. There was something else I wanted to ask you. What's that? Did you ever see that girl again? He'd hoped he would make it through at least one of these presentations without someone asking that question. It was the one he dreaded most. There's not a short answer to that, he said. Yes or no seems pretty short to me. Kelly, said Mr. Brighton, disapproval in his tone. Maybe that's something Reef doesn't want to talk about. That's part of it, Reef said, but the more important part is because yes or no doesn't really tell you anything. Actually, the answer is kind of both. Kelly just looked at him. Reef turned to the teacher. Is there anybody coming in here now? Mr. Brighton shook his head. This is my prep period. What class do you have now, Kelly? Gym. The teacher looked at Reef. You're welcome to stay here and chat longer if you want. Fine with me if it's okay with Kelly, Reef said. He thought of the times he'd done this before, had lost track of how many. The teacher walked over to the door and pressed a button on the wall. In a moment, a secretary's voice came over the classroom speaker. Yes? This is Paul Brighton. Would you please tell Mr. Marshall in the gym that Kelly Bradshaw will be in my classroom a while longer? If that's a problem, he can let me know. I'll tell him, the voice said. Thank you. The teacher returned to Reef. Do you mind if I stay? I'd like to hear the answer to that question myself. Reef pointed to the chairs. We may as well sit down. This'll take a while.